And our next speaker, Katherine Sundermann from MGS Architects. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to the previous speakers. It's great to hear that Nightingale is planning something in Ballarat. That's definitely very exciting. So I'll be taking a bit of a different approach. I'll be talking about networked cities and livable neighbourhoods. And so this is really drawing on a bit of an exchange that I've had over the last 6 years or so between the Netherlands and Victoria. And so really thinking about what we can learn from each other. And I think I actually followed the launch of Balance Victoria last August. And there were lots of really great concepts that were discussed. This idea of a decentralised regions, very interesting. High density near public transport, walkable neighbourhoods. I think Billy Giles Corti was talking about that. And really this focus on evidence-based policy and setting a clear centralised vision. These are words that make me very happy. And I think these are words that also remind me of a place that I'm quite familiar with. So I lived, studied and worked in the Netherlands for 3 years quite a while ago, and I do have an architectural background, and I was quite interested in the kind of questions that were discussed before about how can architects start to design at a much larger scale. Is there a role for design? And so here in the Netherlands, you've got this incredible kind of high-speed rail that connects these very livable neighbourhoods. There were some other words that were mentioned in the Balance Victoria launch that I was a little less comfortable with. This idea of private sector-led investment and also a focus on greenfield development. They kind of reminded me of some other things. So I think it's definitely, I think that's been a theme coming through today, that we need to be very strategic about how we direct this next type of investment. And so if we really are looking at this idea of comparing Geelong and Melbourne to the Netherlands, you'll find that there's a concept of something called the Randstad. So that's really the collection of cities of Amsterdam, The Hague, Rotterdam and Utrecht are thought of together as one metropolis or as a ring city. And so if you see each of them in that 100 by 100 kilometre area, it's really quite interesting to see that they're quite comparable in size physically, but the population in the Randstad is exactly twice what we have. So, and yet there's so much kind of green space between each of those cities. And this idea of kind of looking at and comparing these two different regions is something that I've been exploring for the last 3 years. I've been teaching a subject through the University of Melbourne in partnership with TU Delft University in the Netherlands and also Delta Metropolis Association. And it was really about this information exchange between these two places. So I think it's quite clear what we thought we were learning from them, but what's quite interesting is that they wanted to learn from us as well in terms of how to, if you look at some of the existing neighbourhoods in Melbourne, you get this incredible richness and diversity, which they haven't had so much given that they've had quite top-down, in some places, monotonous development. So they really wanted to learn from that diversity. So it kind of went both ways. I think a really important part of the studio and also a general approach in the Netherlands is this idea at designing at multiple scales. So you really have architects in partnership with planners and economists, etc., thinking about the whole nation as one element, right down to precincts and individual dwellings. And so that's really what I'll be talking about today, is those two scales of the whole networked region and the precincts themselves. And through this studio, we've been able to visit a lot of these incredible places, but also speak to experts in terms of how this works. So today I'm going to be speaking to you about 4 things. Firstly, this idea of the Randstad as a networked metropolis. Then I'll be looking at 2 new Dutch neighbourhoods and what lessons that we can glean from them. Then I'll be looking at 2 projects that I've been working on at MGS Architects. And finally, looking at what opportunities each of these examples give for the future of a balanced Victoria. So if we go back to this idea of the Randstad, this drawing on the right actually shows the commuting networks between those different cities of Rotterdam, Amsterdam, The Hague and Utrecht. And what you'll see is in green, that's when you have quite an equal exchange between those different cities, whereas in red you see people from the regions coming into those major places. So this is a very, very unusual situation. There's not many, there are, but there's not, it's very different to what we have in Melbourne. And I think what's important to note is there's also a high-speed rail between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and you can get there in 40 minutes. But alongside that one high-speed rail route, you have a whole diversity of a very rich regular rail network that really gives you that true network. And what you can find is that a whole lot of people actually do live in Amsterdam and work in Rotterdam and then go to The Hague for a meeting. It really starts to function as one city. And you can really have, each of the cities has their own role in the network as well. It's not that they're all doing the same thing. You can, The Hague's obviously the heart of the European governance. Amsterdam is this incredible historic city, and Rotterdam's seen as a more up-and-coming city since the bombings in the Second World War as a place of design. But this idea of this networked metropolis hasn't happened by chance. Obviously, they've got that long history of how the cities have developed over millennia or over centuries in terms of the medieval cities, equal distance by how far you could get by horse. And then in the 20th century came this idea of thinking about that the ring of cities. And this was a very conscious planning decision. I thought it was interesting that Paul mentioned that the green fields on the edge of the city are kind of unplanned. I think they're very planned. It's just that that's what our planning system is enabling at the moment. And so, yeah, they've really had this concerted effort to do this. But then they had a period of what I've heard them call collective amnesia. So this was a period between 1995 and 2005 where there was a big demand for housing and everyone thought, oh, it's much too difficult to build in the city. Let's build it on the edge of the city. And it's, by Australian standard, it seems like a good level of density and quite livable, but you're still building a dormitory on the edge of the city that's quite hard to get to by public transport. And to correct that, there's now a new obsession with this idea of agglomeration power. So we know that since we're going towards more knowledge-based jobs, that people need to be able to get to those jobs really easily. And so there's a focus on what's the maximum number of people who can reach each other quickly in a kind of high-quality environment. And so there's this program called the Atlas of Smart Urbanisation, and here they looked at the existing cities of The Hague, Delft and Rotterdam and mapped out each of the sites that have a potential for development for more greater density in those areas. And they actually put it into a book. So there's this incredible series of books where they've got the site, the possible density, and they're actually using this as a tool to kind of talk to developers, talk to landowners, talk to future residents about what might happen in these areas. And a really crucial part of it is this concept of having the right density and the right type of program in the right place. So each of those sites has been put into a series of categories. So you've got international, national, regional, public transport and car. And so that really determines, they've set different density targets for each of these. So it really says that you want to have the most density in the most highly accessible locations that have the greatest metropolitan drawing power. Right, and then in the less dense places you can really, give space for farm, for production, that kind of thing. So with that broader context, I now want to introduce two projects that are actually new neighbourhoods in the Netherlands. One's more focused on housing with a bit of work, and the other one is more about work with a bit of living. So the first one is Balkslederham in the north of Amsterdam. So this is a former, you've got the central station down there in the bottom. So just across the River Eye, you have this large area that used to be very, it was kind of where they had all the ports and the shipping, very contaminated, had a lot of social housing there in the 60s, and it was largely owned by the city of Amsterdam. And so they drew up this beautiful plan of how they were going to work with big developers to roll out a whole lot of housing. But then, of course, 2008 happened, so there was no kind of interest for developers or ability to do that development. And so what the city decided to do is actually carve up this site into a series of smaller parcels and sell them to individual families and individual groups. And so what you have here are the people camping out for their opportunity to buy one of these affordable sites. And then there was a long series of participation and workshops for each of these groups to work together to build the communities. And one thing that was interesting was that rather than building just a kind of rolling out the same type of development, they really wanted to try and get the richness and diversity that we see in existing neighbourhoods around the world. And so they're actually looking to Melbourne as well as one of those Carlton in Melbourne is one of those examples. And so what you see through all of these processes is they've built this incredible, rich kind of neighbourhood. I took this photo 6 months after it was finished. I once had someone say to me, "Oh, don't worry about Docklands, just give it 20 or 30 years and it will be great." I think that that's a little bit too long to wait, considering that we can have these options. And this is the benefits that you get from involving future residents in the design. And it's not only about those very low-rise elements, they also have a mixture of offices and apartment buildings at a greater density. And you can see here that they've quite artificially orchestrated this rich diversity of an existing city. And another important element of this project is that there is something called circular Balksletterham. So that's a project for the entire neighbourhood to make it start to have some of those sustainable initiatives that we were talking about earlier in terms of reusing water and waste and really reducing the amount of energy used in that area. So that's the kind of things that you can achieve when you're looking at a whole neighbourhood. You can start to really invest in those precinct-wide initiatives. The second project in the Netherlands is one called Skiovers in Delft. So here you can see it's really on the edge of the city, a former industrial area. And I don't have the annotations, but I don't know if I can do this. Yeah, so essentially you've got the old city of Delft here. You've got the TU Delft University here, some 60s housing, and then finally this is the former kind of industrial area that used to benefit from being on the river Ski. And so now there's a lot of those industrial uses are moving out, but not all at once, and it's all owned by different landholders. So they wanted to come up with a plan of how that this area could slowly evolve and keep some of the qualities that are already there and keep some of the workplaces. So here they've decided to have a bit of a strategy of creating a lively mixed-use area by adding some housing, but then also making sure that they keep space for keep space for workplaces and keep affordable workplaces in this area. And some of that is through retaining some of those old buildings. And so this is a broader version of the whole project. And you can see again, trying to kind of have that mix, that diversity of density and diversity of uses, and a plan that can happen almost organically over time as different sites become available for redevelopment. And so again, you start to see that idea of giving space for parks, but allowing a certain level of density. And so in those two projects, there's quite a few themes coming through. There's that idea of having the right program and the right density in the right place. The benefits of having precinct-wide sustainability. The importance of really combining living and working rather than just having one or the other. Looking at having different actors involved rather than having one big development company that just does the whole thing. And finally, retaining the built fabric, not only for the authenticity of the neighbourhood, but also for affordability. So now I'll change track to two projects that I've been working on in Melbourne. So both are for existing precincts and how we can see how they can transform. The first is Monash Clayton University. So MGS Architects worked on the master plan back in 2011. And we've really seen the campus itself transform. So it's gone from being quite a car-dominated area to a quite incredible campus with high-quality buildings, high-quality spaces, a really clear kind of pedestrian network through the site. But this is, it was when we were doing all of this work with the university, we realised that it was actually one of the biggest employers in Melbourne. And that if you combine it with the hospitals that are nearby, you can really start to see it as being a real hub for employment and a way of decentralising the city. And so this actually came into Plan Melbourne, our city's strategic plan about 5 years ago, this concept of the National Employment and Innovation Clusters. So now Monash is one of those, but you've also got them in Sunshine, Latrobe and East Werribee. And sadly, they have put the legend on top of Geelong, but Geelong is there as well. And so a really exciting new potential for this is, of course, the idea of the suburban rail loop. So this was launched last year, the idea of it, and that we would be able to connect up each of those national employment clusters with the airport. And so, when we're talking about decentralisation, I think that idea of decentralisation of Melbourne within Melbourne is an important part of that idea. And so then we kind of started to think about the campus itself, which is the blue area in the centre, and think about what other uses, how can it kind of really open up and engage with what's happening around it to become a real city in its own right. And so we've been working with the university on sites close to the university that create an enterprise ecosystem. So this is something, again, I picked up in the Netherlands. They like to talk about different sizes of businesses as different types of animals. So you can have the bees, the mice, the gazelles and the elephants. But I think the important message here is that you've got enterprises of different scales, such as the startups versus the Microsofts or whatever else, actually feed off each other, and they form this ecosystem that's important for innovation. The final project that I'll talk to you about today is the Ballarat Creative City Precinct. So this is one we've been working on with the City of Ballarat and also with SGS Economics. So I'm hoping a lot of you know Ballarat reasonably well. It's quite an interesting city. It's only an hour and a half from Melbourne. Obviously had its boom in the gold rush. So you get this very beautiful intact street down Lydiard Street of these 19th century buildings that are quite stunning. But then in between, you have a very car-dominated space. There's lots of parking, lots of bitumen, and not that same pride in the public realm as there is in the buildings. And what we also find is that there's a lot of high vacancies in central Ballarat. No one's living there. A lot of the shops are empty. And so we worked with people from the council and the local community with a series of workshops to think about how we could reframe Ballarat and how it could really become a creative city. And so this concept of having a STEAM-activated community came about. So that's STEM plus art. So it's really thinking about how that can drive the future of the economy. And so we came up with a bit of a plan for central Ballarat. You've got the station here at the top, Lydiard Street. This is Federation University in the south, and that beautiful Sturt Street with the kind of boulevard down there. And so one of the key elements was this idea that it wasn't just about the City of Ballarat doing this project. We needed to have the whole community involved. So whether you're in the creative industries, whether you're a local resident, how can you be involved in making this happen? The second element is about creating a place to live, create, study and visit. So Federation University does have a few sites in both here and here. So how can the university really open up and engage much more with the central city and bring a lot more students to the city, because we all know that that brings a lot of vibrancy. The third point is having a place that showcases and celebrates Ballarat's unique stories and their institutions. So there's all these incredible things going on, but you can't see it. And then a place that permits playfulness, flexibility and experimentation. So given that it's a creative city strategy, a lot of people were saying, I just want a place to perform. I want to be able to do a mural or whatever else, so enabling that kind of thing. And finally, having a place of people-friendly streets that work in all seasons. So as I was saying, the public realm needs some help. But how can we, and we all know that Ballarat's cold, but how can we make it a place where you can actually be outside and embrace the seasons? I think a really key point to end on with this project was that, when we look at the renewal of kind of existing regional cities, and I'm thinking about Geelong, and they've put a whole lot of investment in the public realm, which is really important, but it's only one of a whole range of strategies that you need to make a successful and thriving regional city. So we've upgraded the public realm. You need to reactivate the institutions. So how can the City of Ballarat be talking more with the universities and the art gallery and working together on collective projects? We need to have enabling policies. So postcode 3000 was mentioned earlier today as a way of really invigorating the heart of Melbourne. So can we have similar policies in Ballarat in terms of encouraging people to live above the shops in the central city? And finally, we need enabling events and programs. So we all know that it's all good to have the buildings and the public spaces, but it's nothing without the people that are connecting around different ideas. And so with that kind of whirlwind of different projects that I've shown you, I've got 4 key takeaway messages about what could be opportunities for a balanced Victoria. So we all agree that this whole high-speed rail is crucial, but having a high-speed rail between Melbourne and Geelong is not enough. It needs to be part of a networked region. We need to kind of make those other connections in terms of looking at the other centres within Melbourne and thinking about how this can really function as a networked environment rather than Geelong being the end of the line. We need to think about having the right program and the right density in the right place. So we're doing lots of things in the right direction. The one on the image on the left is actually the new Gov Hub that's being built in Ballarat. So that's going to have 1,000 state government employees next to the train station. So that's an example of having the right kind of density and program in the right place. And then on the other hand, we've got a project called the Paddock in Castlemaine. So that's really on the edge of Castlemaine. If you think about, this is probably about the same density as having a whole lot of suburban houses, but they've gone slightly tighter together, and that gives you space to have a productive garden. It's about creating workplaces, not just housing. We don't want to just have a whole lot of commuters in Geelong that are stuck out there. We need to kind of make it a place that is a place to work as well as a place to live. And so on the left we have Runway Geelong, which is a co-working organisation, and also the Federal Woolen Mills, which is already becoming a bit of a hub for creative industries. So how can we really keep those existing warehouses rather than turning them for these types of uses rather than turning them into residential? And the final comment is that we're not going to get anywhere unless we have citizen participation and citizen-led development. So we heard before that Save Our Suburbs were saying that we couldn't do things in Melbourne, but how about we turn that on its head and say, how can we involve the community more in the decisions about the future of their neighbourhood? And that will enable, better neighbourhoods. And how can we actually take it a step further, like Nightingale, where we get the residents involved in funding new development?